Their 10-year-old only child was shot dead on her way to school, but 5 years later, they discovered something shocking. On a damp gray morning, the Carters find themselves seated across from Detective Harris in a small, windowless room at the Chicago police station. The air is thick, the fluorescent lights harsh, casting sharp shadows across the walls. Harris, a veteran detective with a weathered face and a skeptical eye, listens as they lay out their findings. They speak of maps they've carefully plotted, dots marked where children like Sophie have died, all within a small radius, clustered around school zones, playgrounds, and bus stops. Linda's voice is steady, her eyes locked on Harris. It's not random. It's a pattern. We've been studying this for years, Detective. All these shootings, they line up with the same gang territory. Harris leans back in his chair, fingers tapping the edge of his desk, the creases around his eyes tightening. He's seen grieving parents before, families who can't accept the randomness of violence, the chaos of the streets. He understands their pain but knows that hunches and heartbreak aren't enough to crack a case wide open. I appreciate your dedication, he says, his tone measured, cautious. But without hard evidence, without witnesses willing to testify, there's only so much we can do. James shifts forward, the old chair creaking beneath his weight. He slides a manila folder across the desk, pages covered in scribbled notes, printed maps, and grainy photos. We've found a connection. The same corners, the same streets, all within Blood Vipers territory. Harris's jaw tightens at the name. The Blood Vipers, a violent, deeply rooted gang known for its brutal control over the city's south side. Linda's hand trembles slightly as she continues, her wedding ring glinting under the harsh overhead light. There's a pattern, Detective. It's not just Sophie. It's happening to other children, too. For a moment, the room falls silent, save for the distant clatter of a typewriter somewhere down the hall. Harris glances at the folder, then at the determined faces before him, a flicker of something close to concern crossing his features. "I'll take a look," he says, his voice low, almost a murmur. "But you should both be careful. The streets don't favor curiosity." He slides his card across the desk, its edges worn and creased. As the Carters rise to leave, their footsteps echo against the polished linoleum floors, the door clicking softly shut behind them. Harris watches them go, their figures small and fragile against the backdrop of the bustling station, their grief a silent, heavy presence in the air. But the Carters are far from finished. They've crossed a line. And once you step into the darkness, it's hard to find your way back. James and Linda Carter weren't just grieving parents. They had become investigators in their own right. When the official inquiry into their daughter Sophie's murder went cold, they refused to accept that their little girl would become just another statistic, a faded photograph on a forgotten bulletin board. They started with a map. The kind you might see taped to the wall of a detective's office, a wide sheet of paper, full of red pins and circles, lines connecting streets and alleys, each marker a place where a child's life had ended too soon. They worked late into the night, piecing together clues from news articles, police reports, and the whispered fears of their community. They found a disturbing pattern. Each dot on their map represented a young life cut short, elementary school students, kids in backpacks, bright futures stopped cold on cracked sidewalks and playgrounds. As they traced the lines, a grim realization took shape. The killings clustered tightly around a part of the city claimed by one of its most feared gangs, the Blood Vipers. The Carters learned that this gang operated like a shadow government in certain neighborhoods, controlling corners, alleyways, and abandoned lots. They watched the news carefully, listened to neighborhood whispers, and slowly, painfully, began to see the outlines of a twisted system, a system that demanded loyalty, that required proof of commitment, and that sometimes measured that loyalty in the blood of the innocent. One rainy evening, they met with a man whose life had long drifted to the city's forgotten edges. He was a ghost of the streets, a figure most people looked past without a second thought, a homeless man who claimed to have seen something, someone. He told the Carters about a man he'd seen at a gym, a tall figure with a snake-shaped scar twisting across the side of his neck, a mark that seemed to stretch and coil when he turned his head. This detail struck the Carters like a jolt of electricity. They remembered the vague, fleeting descriptions from the few witnesses who had come forward in Sophie's case. A figure with a distinctive scar. It felt like a thread, a thin, fragile lead, but a lead nonetheless. The Carters took this information to Detective Harris, the same weary-eyed officer who had once warned them against false hope. They laid out their findings, The maps, the patterns, the connection to the Blood Vipers, and now this tip about the scarred man. Harris leaned back in his creaking office chair, fingers tented beneath his chin, eyes narrowing as he considered the words of two desperate parents. He listened without interrupting, his gaze flicking between their tired, determined faces and the scattered documents on his desk. Finally, he spoke, his voice even, his tone carefully measured. "Look," he said, "I understand why you're doing this. I really do. But a rumor from a man on the streets, a scar on a stranger's neck, it's not enough. It's hearsay. It won't hold up in court. I can't move on this without more." He paused, then slowly reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a worn business card. He slid it across the table, the edges frayed, the ink slightly smudged. "But," he added, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "if you find something real, something concrete, I want to be the first to know." James took the card, his hand shaking slightly, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. He and Linda stood, their minds already racing ahead, considering their next move, their next step into a world they barely understood, a world of shadows and secrets, where answers were never freely given. As they stepped back into the gray Chicago morning, the wind whipping at their coats, the chill biting into their bones, they knew one thing for certain: they were closer than ever. They weren't just searching for a killer anymore. They were pushing against a wall of silence, a barrier built on fear and violence. And once that wall cracks, there's no telling what might come crashing through. James Carter found himself standing outside a rundown gym on the city's south side, its rust-streaked sign hanging at an awkward angle, half the neon letters long dead. The air was thick with the sour scent of sweat and old leather, the sharp metallic tang of rusted weights and unwashed mats seeping through the cracked door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand flexing nervously at his side, before stepping into the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The gym's interior was a stark contrast to the bitter chill of the Chicago streets. The air inside was heavy, damp, the low hum of an industrial fan struggling against the heat of bodies moving through well-practiced routines. Men circled each other in the ring, muscles straining, sweat dripping, gloves snapping against flesh with sharp, rhythmic pops. The walls, streaked with years of grime, were covered in torn, yellowing fight posters, their edges curling like dry leaves, the images of long-retired champions staring down with lifeless eyes. James moved slowly along the edge of the gym, his gaze flicking over the faces of the men lifting weights, shadowboxing, and leaning against the cracked concrete walls, their voices low, their eyes watchful. He tried to appear casual, just another man looking to regain his strength, his edge, perhaps even a little respect in a place where power was everything. And then he saw him. At the far end of the gym, near a stack of battered, rust-speckled weights, a tall, heavily built man stood, his broad shoulders rolling as he cracked his neck from side to side. His skin was dark, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes sharp and unblinking, like a predator surveying his territory. And there, on the side of his neck, just above the collar of his sweat-soaked tank top, was a distinctive scar, a twisting, jagged line, shaped like a coiled snake, the flesh pale and puckered against the darker skin surrounding it. James felt his heart lurch in his chest, his fingers tightening around the strap of his worn backpack. This was the man the homeless tipster had described, the man with the snake-shaped scar. The man who, just maybe, had been the one behind the wheel of the car that had stolen Sophie from him. James forced himself to breathe slowly, his eyes never leaving the scarred man's face as he pretended to inspect a worn punching bag, his fingers brushing over the cracked, split leather. He watched as the scarred man, known on the streets as simply Scar, moved between weights, his muscles bulging beneath the dim, flickering fluorescent lights, the cords in his neck tightening as he lifted and lowered massive steel plates with effortless strength. Scar moved with the easy, fluid confidence of a man used to being feared, his every movement sharp and deliberate. He nodded to a few men as they passed, their eyes dropping quickly to the floor, their steps quickening as they moved past him, eager to avoid his attention. James lingered near the corner of the gym, his pulse quickening as he watched Scar step into the ring, his gloved fists rising to meet a smaller, wiry man who seemed to be regretting his decision to spar with him. Scar's punches landed with brutal, bone-rattling force, each strike echoing through the room like a hammer against stone. And then, as if sensing the weight of another's gaze, Scar's head snapped around, his dark eyes locking onto James's for a brief, searing moment. James felt the blood drain from his face, his hands trembling slightly as he forced himself to look away, his heart slamming against his ribs, the dull roar of his own pulse filling his ears. He turned quickly, his shoes squeaking against the sweat-slick floor as he moved toward a small cluster of benches near the entrance. He dropped down onto the cracked, splintered wood, forcing his breathing to slow, his mind racing, his eyes still flicking back to the ring where Scar continued to pound his unfortunate opponent into the ropes. It was then that James heard the voice. A grizzled old trainer, his face a road map of deep lines and old scars, his teeth yellowed and cracked, leaned in close, his breath hot and sharp with the smell of stale tobacco. "You don't want to be staring at him too long, friend," the old man muttered, his voice a rough, gravelly whisper, his eyes darting nervously toward the ring. "That one there. They call him Scar. He's been with the Vipers for years. Moves up the ranks faster than most. You know why." James swallowed, his throat tight, his hands clenching into fists as he forced himself to meet the old man's bloodshot eyes. He shook his head slowly, his voice a tight, barely audible rasp. "No. Why?" The trainer leaned in closer, his breath warm against James's ear, his words slow, deliberate, each one dripping with a kind of quiet, bitter resignation. "Because he's willing to do the things others aren't. Takes the hits nobody else will. They say he earned his stripes by putting bullets in kids. Said he didn't even blink. Called it a rite of passage. An initiation." James felt his stomach drop, his skin turning cold despite the sweltering heat of the gym. He forced himself to nod, to keep his face blank, his expression neutral, even as his heart shattered all over again, the echoes of his daughter's laughter ringing in his ears, her bright, innocent eyes flashing in his mind. As the trainer moved away, his muttered words still hanging in the air like smoke, James rose slowly from the bench, his legs stiff, his muscles trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. He cast one last glance at Scar, his heart pounding, his mind already racing ahead to the next step, the next piece of the puzzle that would bring him closer to the truth, to justice, to some measure of peace. He turned and walked out into the cold, gray light of the Chicago afternoon, his jaw set, his eyes burning, the door slamming shut behind him with a sharp, echoing crack. He had seen the face of his daughter's killer. He was sure of it. And he wasn't going to stop until the world knew it too.
James Carter's mind raced as he left the gym, his thoughts a tangled mix of fear, rage, and cold, calculated determination. He had seen the face of the man he believed had taken his daughter from him, the man with the snake-shaped scar, the man known as Scar. He couldn't shake the memory of that twisted mark, the way it seemed to pulse with each beat of the man's neck, a permanent reminder of the violence he had chosen. James climbed into his aging sedan, the engine rumbling to life with a low, shuddering growl. He tightened his grip on the worn leather steering wheel, his fingers stiff and trembling. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus, his eyes narrowing as he watched the gym's entrance through the streaked windshield, the cold glass fogging slightly from his shallow, rapid breaths. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, moving from a grieving father to something else entirely, an investigator, a hunter. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was this close. Hours passed, the sun dipping below the jagged Chicago skyline, the shadows growing long and twisted across the cracked pavement. The gym emptied slowly, its members filtering out in small groups, their voices low, their heads down, their eyes flicking nervously toward the darkened alleys as they hurried away. And then finally Scar appeared. He moved with the same slow, deliberate confidence James had seen inside, his broad shoulders swaying slightly, his head swiveling from side to side, his eyes sharp and unblinking as he stepped into the cool night air. James's heart slammed against his ribs, his muscles tensing as he watched the scarred man stride down the cracked sidewalk, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete, his breath steaming in the cold night air. James slid his car into gear, the engine growling softly as he eased into traffic, his eyes never leaving Scar's broad, retreating figure. He followed at a cautious distance, his hands white-knuckled against the wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly he felt his teeth grinding against each other, a dull ache spreading through his skull. Scar moved quickly, cutting through alleys, crossing busy intersections without hesitation, his path erratic, unpredictable, a maze of sharp turns and sudden stops that kept James's heart pounding, his nerves fraying with each passing block. And then suddenly, Scar ducked into a narrow, graffiti-covered alley, his dark silhouette melting into the shadows, his footsteps muffled against the damp, trash-strewn pavement. James hesitated for a moment, his pulse thundering in his ears, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He killed his headlights, the world around him plunging into sudden darkness, the cold, metallic taste of fear sharp on his tongue. James eased the car to a stop, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the small flashlight he had tossed into the glove compartment weeks ago. He stepped out, the door creaking softly as he eased it closed, his shoes crunching against the shattered glass and scattered debris that littered the alley floor. The alley twisted and turned, its walls covered in layers of spray-painted symbols and scrawled names, the air thick with the acrid stench of old urine and rotting trash. James moved slowly, his eyes flicking from side to side, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, casting sharp, jagged shadows against the crumbling brick walls. And then he saw it. A warehouse. Its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, its windows shattered, the door hanging slightly ajar, the dim, flickering glow of bare, overhead bulbs spilling out into the night. Faded gang tags covered the walls, the crude symbols twisting and overlapping, a chaotic tapestry of violence and control. James crept closer, his breath catching in his throat as he approached the grim, rusted structure. He edged toward one of the broken windows, his heart pounding, his hands shaking as he pressed his back against the cold, metal wall. He leaned forward slowly, his eyes straining to make out the shadowy figures moving inside, their voices low, their words sharp and clipped, the occasional burst of harsh, bitter laughter cutting through the steady thump of bass-heavy music. And then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim, smoky interior, he saw it. A wall. A wall covered in Polaroids, their edges curled, the colors faded, the faces frozen in time, their eyes wide, their smiles bright, their innocence preserved in thin, glossy squares of plastic and paper. James felt his stomach drop, his breath catching in his throat, his pulse thundering in his ears as his eyes moved slowly over the photos, his mind struggling to process the horror before him. And then, there, near the center, pinned among the dozens of faces, he saw it. Sophie's face. Her school picture, the one Linda had insisted on framing, the one James had carried in his wallet for years, the one that now felt like a lead weight in his back pocket, pressing against his skin, burning through the thin, worn leather like a brand. James stumbled back, his mind spinning, his heart racing, the bile rising in his throat as he struggled to breathe, his legs weak, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and numb as he hit the speed dial, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as the line crackled to life. Linda's voice, thick with sleep and fear, crackled through the tiny speaker, her words frantic, confused, her voice rising in pitch as James whispered the words that had been trapped in his throat, the words he had never wanted to speak, the words that shattered the thin, fragile shell of hope he had clung to for so long. I found her. I found Sophie. Linda's breath hitched, her words stumbling over each other as she struggled to respond, her voice cracking, breaking, shattering beneath the weight of his revelation. James forced himself to breathe, to think, his mind racing as he scanned the darkened warehouse, his eyes flicking back to the wall of Polaroids, the faces staring back at him, their smiles frozen, their eyes empty, their futures stolen. He whispered a final desperate plea into the phone, his voice shaking, his heart breaking. Call Harris. Now. James stumbled back into the darkness, his mind reeling, his heart shattered, his soul scarred, his daughter's face burned into his mind, her bright, innocent eyes staring back at him from a wall of stolen futures.